Hello everyone. Welcome to my channel. I'm really excited to bring you today's video. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Let's get started. In 1971, at the age of just 17, Juliane Koepcke was traveling on a LANSA Airlines plane from the capital of Peru, Lima, to Koepcke. When the flight began, everything seemed normal. The weather that day was quite bad, but Juliane and her mother were on a scientific expedition to the tropical forest region of Koepcke. As the plane ascended into the sky, covered with clouds, no one on board had any concerns about what was to come. However, shortly after, a much larger storm system than expected changed the plane's course. Suddenly, the plane was rocked by a violent electrical storm and severe turbulence began. The plane started to shake, sway, and lose its direction. Juliane, for a moment, couldn't fully comprehend what was happening. The rapidly increasing fear mixed with the sensation that everything was spiraling out of control. The plane continued to fly for a while, but then it suddenly started to fall. At that moment, everything went dark. The plane began to plummet with a loud crash, colliding with the ground in a huge roar. The storm was so intense that Juliane's eyes were closed. Among the deafening sounds, crashes of metal and the splintering of wood, everything turned into chaos. When the noise from the crash finally stopped, the world around her fell into silence. When Juliane regained consciousness, she found herself in a profound silence. For several seconds, she couldn't open her eyes. Her mind was confused and she was unaware of what was happening. Finally, she slowly brought her hands to her face but couldn't feel her face. As she quickly looked around, she tried to lift her head. The plane was in pieces, shattered from all sides, and the surrounding area bore the marks of a disaster. The wreckage was scattered all around her in the forest. At that moment, she realized that everything had ended, and she might be the only one alive. After the crash, immediately following her state of unconsciousness, Juliane was injured but trying to come to terms with the shock of her life. Everything was dark. For a while, she wanted to believe that everything was normal, but the scene in front of her painfully reminded her of how different reality was. When she found herself thrown around, she didn't see anyone alive on the plane. The storm was still ongoing. Outside, the wind was blowing violently, and it was clear that everything had been completely destroyed. The thick, sticky heat of the air caused her skin to sweat immediately. Slowly, she rose and began to look around. Pieces of the plane that had fallen from the trees were scattered deep into the dense forest. At the same time, she knew she had to start searching for a way to survive. But at that moment, the real shock for Juliane came from the fact that no one had survived the crash. Her mother, father, all the passengers and the flight crew were dead. She was the only one left alive after the crash. This was a terrifying realization for the young girl. Among the people she had lost was her mother, who had died with her husband in the crash. In that moment, Juliane realized she was alone and had to survive. For a while longer, she couldn't think clearly. In the midst of the wreckage, with airplane parts, broken glass, and metal scattered everywhere, it felt like she was seeing a nightmare. With everything collapsing around her, the traces of the lives that once inhabited the plane, the lives that had once lifted it off the ground, were now gone. Eventually, she understood that the only thing she could do in this situation was to survive. Once she accepted that, her survival instinct kicked in, and she made up her mind. I have to do something to survive. She pulled herself together and took a deep breath. Now, the only thing left to do was to try to survive in the vast, desert-like jungle. After a period of unconsciousness, Juliane began to regain her senses. The storm was still raging, but everything around her had quieted down. The cuts and bruises on her body hurt, but in that moment, surviving was far more important than the pain in her body. She tried to pull herself together. The grief of losing her mother and the other passengers would later become a significant trauma, but at that moment, her only goal was survival. When she stood up, she realized everything around her was blurry. The humid heat intensified her fatigue and horror. Yet her survival instinct wouldn't let her accept the situation. Somehow she preferred to take a step into the deep forest rather than stay in the chaotic environment. All around her were the scattered remains of the broken plane, but as she realized the extent of the disaster surrounding her, she knew she had to find a way to survive. After overcoming the initial shock of the crash, Juliane began to think more clearly. Everything around her had been destroyed, leaving nothing but a vast, ruined landscape. There was no trace of the plane left. Only the massive, dense Amazon jungle remained. At first, she lacked the courage to venture into the depths of the forest, but then her feet began to guide her. Her mind made the decision to do what was right. First, she checked her physical condition. She tried to stand up slowly, but her body resisted. Her arms and legs were covered in cuts and bruises. Her face was badly injured from the impact of the crash. She had a large wound on her back. The cuts had almost torn her skin completely. Her leg hurt a lot, but she wasn't weak enough to feel like giving up. She quickly pulled herself together and took a few steps. As she began to walk, each step became harder. But stopping, staying still or remaining immobile was not an option. When she regained her senses, her will to survive was stronger than all the physical pain. She decided to head into the depths of the forest. There was only one thought in her mind. Somehow she had to find help. This seemed like the only way out of the jungle. Not finding any human traces around her only pushed her further into despair. No one had survived the crash. She was alone. But loneliness pushed her to be brave. She started to move toward the forest. Her feet ached, but she kept walking. At first, the journey seemed easy. But as she encountered the true nature of the Amazon jungle, things became difficult. The forest began to pull her in. The rain had made the ground slippery, and the humid air made every step heavier. Her body felt like it could collapse at any moment. But she continued to move forward slowly yet steadily. She had to move slowly because her legs were weak and painful. At that moment, every step felt like a small victory. Juliane taught herself the basic steps to survive. She struggled with essential survival skills such as finding water, not getting lost in the forest, and searching for food. However, a greater danger than hunger and thirst was the feeling of loneliness and fear. As she moved forward, lost in the darkness of the forest, there were moments when she thought she couldn't take it anymore. But hopelessness never overcame her. Instead, over time, her determination to do whatever it took to survive grew stronger. At first, Juliane couldn't quite figure out what to do, but with time, she learned how to find water and food by observing the rivers, local plants, and wildlife in the forest. Somehow, she managed to meet these basic needs to survive. Drinking water from the rivers and discovering the food sources of the Amazon, applying the survival skills she had once only read about in books inspired her. Also, by following her instincts, she kept trying to stay hopeful while navigating the depths of the forest and searching for any sign of help. As her survival instincts guided her, a profound change began to take place within Juliane. Her body was being pushed to its limits and she was in pain, but her mind and spirit were growing stronger. Each passing hour made her more resilient and determined. With the desire to survive just one more day, she could continue her fight for life. At first, she felt like she was lost in the terrifying depths of the forest, but over time, Juliane began to believe that she could find a trace here. If she could find a way to survive, she would eventually reach people again and leave this horrifying experience behind her. After deciding to venture deeper into the Amazon jungle, Juliane's survival struggle became even more challenging. The first few days were filled with physical and mental obstacles. Everything was new and unknown. In the vast jungle, she was alone, hungry, and thirsty, doing everything she could to survive. However, this was never going to be easy. Her surroundings were filled with towering tropical trees and dense vegetation. The humidity of the air made each step harder, causing her sweat to accumulate. Rain poured intermittently from the depths of the forest, which made the cuts on Juliane's body sting even more. However, this rain was also her greatest ally. Finding water was one of the essential conditions for survival. Despite feeling helpless at times, Juliane had to make the right decisions with her instincts and survival intuition. Most of the first days were spent searching for water. Although her back was badly injured when the plane fell, her body was still functioning. Her mind was driven by the desire to survive. She searched the rivers and streams in the forest, trying to find water sources. Fortunately, she managed to find several rivers deep in the jungle. However, she had to evaluate every sip of water cautiously. Water was a survival resource, but here in the Amazon jungle, it was always uncertain how safe the water could be. Instinctively, she preferred to drink clean water from the riverbanks. Finding food was even more difficult than finding water. Searching for fruit in the forest was quite dangerous because many tropical fruits could be poisonous. Juliane had to be very careful about this. Consciously, she began to examine every type of plant carefully to distinguish between poisonous and safe ones. There were many different types of plants and fruits around her, but distinguishing which ones were safe was quite challenging. At first, she could only find a few fruits. However, these fruits provided her with some relief. She was able to fill her stomach a little, but finding food wasn't just about plants. Another concern for Juliane was the wild animals of the forest. The Amazon jungle was home to many dangerous animals known for their fierce nature. Every moment spent in the jungle, she was faced with the possibility of being attacked by one of these animals. She listened to every sound around her and kept track of every movement. Sometimes the noises she heard from a distance in the jungle indicated that wild animals were nearby. However, avoiding these animals could increase her chances of survival. Therefore, she always had to be cautious and avoid going deeper into the forest. Mentally, she was also facing constant challenges. Loneliness was Juliane's greatest enemy. Accepting the loss of her mother and the other passengers was becoming harder with each passing day. But by suppressing this pain, she became even more determined to survive. Her survival instincts suppressed the negative thoughts in her mind, giving her strength. "I must live, I must survive," she kept telling herself, because somehow there was still a chance. As her mental strength grew, her physical endurance also increased. She managed to survive for a week. Finding water and food required a tremendous amount of effort. But she continued drinking from the rivers and occasionally found small tropical fruits. However, what Juliane needed was not just water and food, but also the hope of finding help. She still felt incredibly alone, unable to get any assistance. She walked along the riverbanks in the depths of the forest. As the days passed, every step weakened her, but her mental strength never faltered. She continued to venture deeper into the forest, exploring the Amazon's complex ecosystem. In the early days, her focus was solely on surviving. But as the days went on, she realized that this forest could be a survival space for her. Juliane began to move in harmony with the nature around her, and she started to feel connected to the vast jungle where life continued. Mentally strengthened, she discovered her inner strength and became more resilient with each passing day in her battle for survival. While continuing her survival efforts, she also kept observing her natural surroundings to maintain her courage. These first few days were not only physically, but also emotionally challenging. However, every moment spent in the Amazon jungle inspired Juliane in her survival struggle. After the crash, Juliane Koepcke began facing the greatest challenges of her life as she fell into the Amazon jungle. During the first few days, as she continued her efforts to survive, the feeling of loneliness grew deeper. She was alone, with neither a person nor a rescue team around her. She was the only survivor of the crash. This meant a heavy burden, both physically and psychologically. In the jungle, despite all her survival instincts, being alone turned into one of the greatest battles Juliane faced as a human. With each passing day, the feeling of loneliness intensified, and she walked alone into the depths of the jungle toward an uncertain future. With every step, the intense silence and desolation that surrounded her made her feel even more abandoned. Lost in the depths of the forest, every moment was spent fighting the fears she faced. The noise of the jungle and the unexpected sounds of wildlife made her think she could put herself in danger. But at the same time, she was engaged in an inner battle against that silence and loneliness. Juliane's whole life passed before her eyes. She had lost her family and loved ones. She had no strength left to do anything for them, and she had to accept this reality. In every moment, alone in this vast forest, she had to push her survival instincts to the limit to keep moving forward. Loneliness mentally drained her more and more each day. At the same time, there was a deep fear, a constant feeling that she was on the edge of survival. No matter how hard she tried, there was no one around her, no glimmer of hope, nothing to give her strength. Sometimes the lost sounds or strange noises from nearby animals would make her heart race. But despite every fear and feeling of loneliness, she had to keep surviving. The heat of the air was also unbearable. Juliane's body had weakened after the crash. Her back wounds were constantly bleeding, and her leg ached. However, physical pain was less overwhelming compared to the mental battle. The hot air exhausted her. The humid atmosphere felt like a weight on her chest with every breath. Her feet were sore from days of walking, which further slowed her down. With each step, both physically and mentally, she was becoming more and more drained. But instead of collapsing, she got up again with every step. Although she frequently fell and fainted, she got back up each time and continued on her way. Between the heat, excessive humidity, and scarred wounds, she was enduring a test that pushed her physical resilience to the limit. Hunger and thirst also made Juliane's struggle even more difficult. The Amazon jungle was a place that showed how hard it was to find food and drinkable water. For the first few days, she tried to find tropical fruits, but most of the time she had to avoid fruits that might be poisonous. Slowly, she began to feel that finding food was becoming nearly impossible. Finding rare water sources within the jungle also took time. Fortunately, she managed to reach water from time to time, but she drank every drop cautiously because being in an unknown forest, she was concerned about how safe the water was. Mentally, the loneliness and harsh environment tested Juliane's patience with each passing moment. The challenges Juliane faced were not only physical, but also emotionally burdensome. Dealing with the fear of her own death, not hearing from her loved ones, and sometimes confronting the thought of not surviving despite all her efforts was extremely difficult. Spending the night deep in the jungle, being alone under the stars, made her feel even more isolated. During those moments, the only thing she could think of was surviving and somehow finding a way out. But with every passing moment, loneliness made it even harder mentally. At night, as she ventured into the dark depths of the forest, she constantly fought the feeling that something would go wrong. The feeling of loneliness revived with every step she tried to take patiently, and at times she felt powerless to find the lost hope again. But somehow she had to keep going. Every day she took another step, not to lose hope and just to survive. With her inner strength and survival determination, Juliane always managed to keep going. No matter what, she felt the presence of an inner resistance to cope with this slowly fading and retreating loneliness. Beyond survival, facing loneliness and confronting this terrifying solitude itself became a kind of victory for Juliane. Juliane Koepcke's fight for survival lasted for 11 days in the depths of the Amazon jungle. Every day she had to chase after everything necessary to survive, pushing her survival instincts and crossing her physical and mental limits. Until that day, she had moved deeper into the jungle, becoming increasingly lonely with each passing day. But over time, she began to notice something that might lead her to a sign of rescue. The desire to survive inside Juliane gave her strength and courage. While she was exhausted, she had to continue moving forward without succumbing to hopelessness. But with each step, she took advantage of every opportunity nature offered to find the lost hope once again. One day, while trying to move towards a more open space, her eyes noticed something that seemed like a path through the thick trees of the jungle. This was a clue for Juliane, who had not seen any signs of human presence for a long time. At first, she thought it was a hallucination, but her survival instincts made her take determined steps. This path must have been used by forest workers. Among the trees, the traces of a person's footsteps and the trail became a symbol of the rescue route she had been searching for. At first, she wasn't sure if the path was the right one. Fatigue and hunger were overwhelming her mind. But with each step, she found more hope. This trail felt like a sign of something lost, perhaps help or salvation being close. At that moment, without thinking about the size and challenges of the Amazon forest, she decided to follow this path. With each step, she was leaving behind the loneliness and fears she had carried so far. After a while, she encountered a group of forest workers along the path. In that moment, all the strength inside Juliane came to the surface. Seeing people reignited a spark of hope within her. The fact that they were working in the forest made Juliane think that rescue might finally be near. These people gave her water and food. The water replaced everything her body had lost up until then. Slowly sipping it, she began to regain the strength needed to survive. The food also reminded her how crucial it was for a person to stay alive. Although Juliane knew she still had to struggle much more to survive before that moment, it was now that the doors to real salvation were opening. The forest workers gave Juliane an opportunity. They told her they would notify the rescue teams. At that moment, the fears inside Juliane eased a little. Because rescue was no longer just a hope, it was a reality. Juliane's battle for survival was coming to an end. However, even after that moment, she realized that everything was not yet completely over. Once her basic needs were met, the rescue teams contacted the forest workers and Juliane was airlifted by helicopter from where she was. The moment the helicopter carried Juliane away was like a form of victory. Salvation was not just the end of her struggle for survival. It was also the feeling of being reborn with every step. The rescue team saving her life once again became a symbol for Juliane. The forest, where she had been lost in its depths, had finally brought her back to the world through the will and determination of one person. Before boarding the rescue helicopter, an image from the past became clear in Juliane's mind. She thought about how everything she had lost throughout this process had gained meaning with the life she had regained. This experience had become something she would never forget for the rest of her life. Every passing day, every step, had taught her how valuable life truly was. Leaving the Amazon jungle with all the lessons she had learned about life and survival felt like both an end and a new beginning for her. When Juliane Koepcke was finally rescued after 11 days in the Amazon jungle, her body and mind were filled with deep exhaustion. The moment she was found by the forest workers was not just a physical rescue. It was also a psychological turning point for Juliane. A light of hope that everything was coming to an end had finally reached her. The forest workers immediately took Juliane and brought her to a hospital. On the way, she was grateful with every step, because this rescue was not only a physical recovery but also a rebirth. When she arrived at the hospital, her body was very weak and injured. The crash and the time spent in the jungle had left deep marks on Juliane's body. Severe fluid loss and malnutrition had completely disrupted her body's balance. Her wounds, especially the serious injuries to her back and leg, were treated as first aid. IV fluids were administered, and during the treatment, she occasionally passed out. Despite all of this, the physical recovery process began. However, every moment spent in the hospital room showed her that not only her body, but also her mind needed healing. After spending a few days in the hospital, Juliane was finally able to contact her family. It was hard to describe the joy of hearing her family on the phone. Her mother and father had found it hard to believe that their daughter was alive because news of the crash had spread, and it was reported that not only Juliane, but also the other 91 passengers had lost their lives. Juliane's miraculous survival filled her family with a mix of joy, relief, surprise, and gratitude. At that moment, it symbolized the victory Juliane had achieved over all the difficulties she had faced and her renewed grasp on life. The happiness her family felt when they heard that she was healthy and safe was beyond words. During the phone conversation, there was a moment filled with both joy and tears. However, the effects of this experience on Juliane did not just continue physically, they also lasted emotionally and psychologically for a long time. The terrifying days she spent in the forest left lasting marks on her mind. The loneliness, fear, hunger, and thirst had tested her psychological resilience. The moment she fell into the depths of the jungle, she had opened the door to death. However, finding a way to survive and make it out of there not only proved her physical strength but also allowed her to understand her inner strength. The battle for survival had pushed her limits and demonstrated the immense power of the human will. The process of mental recovery was much more difficult for Juliane. It took a long time for her to start feeling safe again and return to her old, normal. She began having nightmares, and the horrific images of the jungle remained fresh in her mind. Gradually, the feelings of loneliness and abandonment would occasionally take hold of her again. The echoes of the terrible crash and the 11 days of survival lingered in the dark corners of her mind for a long time. But Juliane made an effort every day to overcome these traumas. She had given everything to survive. Now she had to show the same determination to heal mentally. One day, during a conversation with her family, Juliane realized how valuable the fight for survival had been and how it had pushed the limits of human endurance. This event had become one of the turning points in her life. After trying to survive alone in fear for so long, she understood that survival was not just a physical achievement, it was also an emotional and psychological triumph. It wasn't enough for her body to heal, her spirit also needed to recover. Accepting the pain and fear in her mind, facing them and learning lessons from them became the most important part of her healing process. Over time, Juliane embraced the lessons survival had taught her. Now, like a reborn person, she drew strength from the traces of that moment and looked toward the future with hope. The 11 days in the Amazon jungle had not only pushed her physical limits, but also allowed her to discover her inner strength. She now knew just how strong a human could be, and that no matter how terrifying the challenges, the instinct to survive could pull a person out of any disaster. After her rescue, Juliane's life would never be the same. With her miraculous survival, she showed how inspiring the battle for survival can be on a global scale. A person who doesn't give up in the face of adversity and survives proves to be strong enough to give meaning to another life. She no longer just wanted to survive. She wanted to show everyone the boundless power of the human spirit and endurance, learning from what she had gone through.